Okay, this is Module 5, and the focus of this module is for me to tell you all about everything you need to know to do your midterm and your final projects. So for this term, I've chosen to do a case about a daycare cooperative. Certainly, if you follow media reports at all, you're probably aware of the challenges in the daycare sector since Canada went with the $10 a day option. So while it's cheap, the problem is parents can't find places for their children. So that sort of spurred my interest, and then I heard about a credit union that actually started a daycare. So I thought, that's very interesting. So this is based on a real company. So for the first part of the project, for your midterm, which I'm calling Project 1, I want you to prepare a SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So strengths and weaknesses, those are internal to the organization, whereas opportunities and threats are external. And be careful not to confuse opportunities with alternatives. So an opportunity would be, for example, if you're looking at demographics and say there's an aging population, and you might think, okay, so that's an opportunity, but an alternative would be maybe to open a seniors home. So opportunities and alternatives are not the same. And so just make sure when you're talking about strengths and weaknesses, you're talking about the company, opportunities and threats. These are factors external to the company that can have an impact on them. So the SWOT is worth 8 marks. Then I want you to identify 2 potential alternatives to address the issues that are presented in the case. So you don't have to actually have a recommendation at this point. This is just to look at some potential alternatives. So when you identify the alternatives, so just identifying the 2 alternatives is worth 2 marks. And the next part is, for each of the alternatives, I want you to look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of the alternatives. So when you're looking at that, you typically would go back to your SWOT and look to see, are there any strengths that this alternative can draw on? Are there any opportunities out there? And on the flip side, if the company has some weaknesses and some threats, you'd have to address that as potential disadvantages. So there will be lots of advantages and disadvantages, but you should also look back to the SWOT as well to see if there's something there you can bring into your advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives. And of course, grammar, spelling, business writing style, that's worth 2 marks. So when you're doing your case, so this is based on a real cooperative, you are not to call them or anything like that. You're welcome to look them up on the internet, and the information is in the case as to their website, but do not call the credit union or the cooperative itself, because they're very small organizations and they can't get into answering questions. So now, the SWOT analysis. So as I mentioned, strengths are internal to the co-op, weaknesses are internal, opportunities are external. As I mentioned, this is not the same as an alternative. And the threat is external to the co-op. And then another technique to make sure you've identified all of the SWOT is to look at using PESTEL. So PESTEL stands for political, economic, sociocultural, technological, ecological, environmental, and legislative. So this is basically a checklist. So when you do your first cut through and come up with your initial SWOT, Then use Pastel to see if there's something you may have forgotten. Is there anything in terms of the political environment that could have an impact, the economic, technological, environmental, legislative? It's just more of a checklist. It's not a separate section. It's just to make sure that your SWOT is complete and you've considered everything. And of course, not all elements of Pastel would be applicable in every situation. It's just another way to help you make sure you've considered everything that could impact the co-op. So part 2, which is basically your final and is due on the last day of classes, now you are expected to come up with a strategy that will address the main issues presented in the case. So you need to consider the constraints that are discussed in the case, such as the physical space limitations, staffing constraints, regulatory compliance, Munden's overall lack of time, that's the CEO of the credit union, and then propose some creative and practical solutions that will allow the daycare to accommodate more students, so more children rather. So the problem with the daycare is by the time it was built, demand had exceeded the number of spaces they had available. So the idea is can they come up with a solution to address this? And of course, when you're doing that, you have to look at the financial part as well. So developing the strategy is worth 12%. Then the implementation plan is worth 5%, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. And then you need to prepare 3-year income statements. We need to know, you have to figure out where the money is coming from to do whatever plan you come up with. So that's important. And when you're doing the income statement, you just start from the one that's given you in the case and you build from there. And in this part of the project, grammar, spelling, business writing style is worth 3%. So for your recommendations, you need to justify the recommendation. So no recommendation is perfect. It's always going to have some advantage or disadvantage. So when you're giving your recommendations, explain how your weaknesses and threats can be mitigated. And you may not be able to mitigate all of them. And if that's the case, you just state that. But it's important to acknowledge that there are weaknesses and threats that should be mitigated to the extent possible. And then you also want to demonstrate how the co-op, its name, Growing Our Future Daycare Co-op, can capitalize on its strengths and opportunities, so its internal strengths and the external opportunities. So now for the financial forecast. Whenever you're coming up with recommendations for whether it be a business or a not-for-profit, any type of organization, you're going to have to develop a forecast. So basically what you should do is start with the income statement that's provided in the case, then from there extend it to take account of your increases in revenue for whatever you're proposing and increases in expenses. And you also need to provide assumptions to accompany the forecast. So, if you're saying revenue is going to increase by 10% or whatever, you just have to put down your assumptions as to, where you came up with that number and why. So you have to have assumptions. So basically, you should prepare it in Excel, and then at the bottom of the spreadsheet, you would have your assumptions section. And then when you finish the document, then copy the Excel spreadsheet into a Word document as an appendix. So the financial forecast is basically an appendix, but you discuss it in the body of the report. So the idea here is you'll say, you're going to identify the sources of your financing. So if you're going to put an extension on the building, for example, or build a new building, or whatever it is you're going to do, you have to identify how much it's going to cost and where that money is coming from. And then you have to look at your projected revenue streams and your projected expenses for 3 years. So once you've come up with this plan and your forecast, you need to have an implementation plan. So an implementation plan it specifies what you're going to do, so what specific actions are needed to implement your recommendations, who's going to do this work. You know, oftentimes people will come up with great ideas, but if you're a very small organization, you have to take that into account, that you don't have a lot of people to do the work. So you have to identify who's going to do the work, and then the time. So when are you going to, you know, which activities are you going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, etc. And then money. So how much is it going to cost to implement your recommendation, and where are these funds coming from? So you should prepare your implementation plan in a table and include it as an appendix, and then you would discuss the implementation plan in the body of your report. And that concludes the overview on the midterm and the final projects.